Now we're going to go ahead and examine the urban areas outside of North America. So looking at what the differences between the urban areas and the central business district are like outside of the United States. So that's going to be kind of our focus for today. So comparing the CBD in North America versus Europe, if you just take these two different looks, so here's kind of part of New York City, which again is just kind of, in my opinion, one big CBD, especially on Manhattan Island, compared to here in London. And if you just look at the organization, so go back and think about to chapter 1 when we talked about how things are kind of spaced out and organized. What are some of the differences you think that you just see initially on this map? So just go ahead and take kind of a second, pause this, and just kind of what are some of the differences you see? So hopefully you took a pause, looked at it, and jotted down some differences. But if you kind of look, obviously the geometric angles, the shapes, and the kind of outlay is a little bit different, kind of as we see a lot of places that are kind of more triangular in shape or more circular in shape versus what we see here. And that would also apply to a lot of other European cities as well that kind of existed kind of more in circular space, away from the camera, more circular in motion than opposed to the geometric, right and left angles, north, south, east, west kind of directional stuff that we did here in the United States when we were setting up our cities and locations. So here we have a picture of downtown Minneapolis at nighttime. Okay. Oh man, I need to adjust that before we do this in class. How many of Minneapolis's central business district skyscrapers are 25 stories above are residential? Only 3 of them that are 25 stories or taller are residential. Only 3 are, and one of them is a hotel. So really, only 2 apartment buildings. So that should tell you about the number of people living in, again, all these high rises in Minneapolis. Now, mind you, there are a bunch of different, apartment buildings that actually do live in the CBD or just outside of it. One of my roommates from college, he kind of lives right outside Loring Park, kind of one of those not very high-rise complexes, but again, living in the central business district itself. So, and then we compare that here to Paris with the Eiffel Tower. And so we're going to kind of compare and use some of the differences between France with the United States. We're not just France, but looking at Paris as kind of our example here. So the differences between European and North American urban areas. So in North America, as we've stated, okay, typically low-income residents are usually clustered just outside the downtown areas. Typically, again, in highly clustered, lower end or well overused apartments, houses, duplexes, and typically we see most wealthy people live further away from the CBD, but we do know that there are definitely wealthy people that live inside of it. Okay, few people, and so yeah, most of the wealthy people or wealthier people live in the suburbs. More business than consumer services that exist in and around the CBD. So most, again, it's supporting other businesses. So again, advertising, banking, financial services, lawyers, that are, again, found in that CBD in the United States, as opposed to, again, not a whole lot of consumer services other than, maybe some entertainment, music, restaurants, but not a whole lot of actual like grocery stores or gas stations would you find in the downtown area. Again, it's more restaurants and more entertainment than anything else. Okay, in Europe, you have fewer high-rise actual buildings and skyscrapers overall in comparison. All right, more people are living in the central business district, especially more of the wealthy people living there. Often have then we often see that they have driving restrictions in the CBD to limit traffic. So thus, you actually can't drive down a number of different streets inside of different European cities. I visited Prague about 2 years ago with my wife, and we literally walked. That's a different story about how we ended up walking from a European football game. That was me thinking I knew the way back. I got us lost, but for the most part, there are a few main roads that really do not allow any traffic. They're wide enough to allow cars, but for the most part, these streets are designed for walking. And you could walk down this one main street in Prague for about 45 minutes to an hour and see almost no cars in most of these, streets or alleyways because, again, they're designed for walking. And that's kind of how most European cities have designed their downtown areas, especially if they're more historical, touristy places where, again, it's more attraction for not driving. So that's, again, part of the setup, right? Taller apartment buildings do exist in Europe, but most of them exist more outside the CBD in more of the, again, inner or outer ring suburbs, when that's typically where we see more lower income people and immigrants living. So those are typically more higher dense, than what we'd see initially in kind of the Twin Cities metro area or other parts of the U.S. In terms of who's living there and how dense it is. So the suburbs are actually pretty dense with people, but not necessarily always. I mean, downtown is also dense too, but dense with wealthier people than what you see in terms of Minneapolis, St. Paul, where while there are wealthy people, it's not in exceedingly high numbers because there are many more businesses downtown. In Europe, while there are businesses, there's just lot more people on higher scales living in those areas. So the suburbs, again, being predominantly for lower income people within that. So typically that also means that because you have higher end people living in downtown areas, that means that there are more and better consumer services. Again, think about healthy food access with grocery stores in downtown rather than in the suburbs. So again, think about that in terms of the comparison to the idea of food deserts. And again, you can kind of see that in kind of monthly household income in Paris. You can kind of see that in many cases, like in Bobigny, I don't know how to speak French, but I would assume that's how it's said. Okay, less than $1,000 per month, but it's still fairly high in terms of the number of people living in that part of town. All right, in terms of the number of the population density. So again, you can kind of see, that even while there's not a whole lot of people living there, they're not probably the best housing based on the level of income based on the level of income that they have. That's just more just comparison for people living in Manhattan and how the population fluctuates during a normal day. So switching over to less developed countries and looking at it in terms of the sector model, because the sector model does this pretty well in terms of the layout of cities in those less developed countries. So in many cases, we see in less developed countries, and again, think back to the primate city, we see a megacity. And this is an urban area that has more than 10 million inhabitants, typically related to explosive population growth and migration. So think about, again, the primate city that has all the attractions, it has the services, it has the education, the medical centers, and not a whole lot of equitable access to services outside of the primate city. So hence, people are drawn to the megacity or the primate city because of that. And that's related, again, as countries get bigger and bigger with their population growth. This is kind of the brain drain, where people are going to get the best jobs, where they're going to get the best medical services, the best living situations are probably going to be, again, near this megacity, but that's also an issue because there's too much. Too many people and not enough resources in the megacity or the primate city. So the wealthy live in what's considered the spine area that's just outside, again, of the central business district. So the spine being kind of right here, and they have this really, really big mall or market area that's commercial for the high-end consumers. The spine typically has the best amenities, the best access to water and electricity and internet, and typically is the highest land value area and the most intensive use because that's where you see the wealthiest people congregating. So that's going to be where you're going to find them. Okay, as cities in these less developed countries are generally primate cities, they draw in a lot of people, but not enough jobs, houses, or services of any quality or quantity to go around, which leads to an increase in pollution because you're getting overpopulation, but not enough services to support it. And because of this, we also see an increase of what we call informal, also known as squatter settlements, that are areas within this less developed country inside the city, where people illegally establish their own residences with houses or shelters on land they do not own or rent. So that's kind of those areas where we consider to be disamenities here. All right, so you kind of think squatter settlements kind of in this area of disamenity, but also out here as well. All right, you kind of see different levels of growth, the middle class kind of buoying both of those two areas. I'm not sure C2 accretion, I don't know what that exactly means. But again, you can kind of see where these things are predominantly found within there. And that's going to be, when you talk about Sao Paulo, okay, being the one of the major cities of Brazil, okay, you can look at monthly household income. Okay, here's the central business district where you can again see that very large income level, and you can kind of see that going out in various directions. And then where you see it less and less and less inside of this city. And its surrounding suburbs. So you can kind of see that within it due to growth. So there's kind of the visuals here of some of the squatter or informal settlements, and the fact that in many cases they're built in kind of trash heaps. They're built with materials whatever they can find. Schools, they lack electricity or stable electricity. Schools, housing, bathrooms, and sewers. So you can kind of think, how does this connect to disease and levels of development within a country? We got 2 different videos that you can watch on that. So Philippines and the cemetery slums and how they're living there, and then the favelas within Rio. Now, also to keep in mind is the fact that many of the places in the developing world do have colonial legacies, or legacies of colonialism and imperialism put in by either the Europeans or in some cases within the United States. So we see, 2 cathedrals here, one in Vietnam, okay, and then one in Brazil, Brazil being a former Portuguese colony, one in here within Vietnam being a former French colony, both of them being Catholic countries, hence you see Catholic churches. Here you see a Spanish colonial building in Manila in the Philippines, and then the Manila Post Office, built more like a U.S. government building because the U.S. did in fact oversee the construction of it when it was the power in charge of the Philippines during its imperialistic legacy in the early 1900s to like the 1930s and 40s. And the post office was, I think, built in the 20s or 30s. So again, similar to what you might see, with the Minnesota or the U.S. Federal Building, or I'm trying to think, the Treasury Building here in Minneapolis, St. Paul, kind of along the Mississippi River, is similar in style to that. It kind of also looks like, a little bit of a lot of the other buildings in Washington, D.C. and a lot of other capital buildings in the U.S. So that's where you kind of see the legacy of that inside of the developing world from, Europe and the United States. So that should hopefully kind of give you an example of how these models differ and where you see these things, or maybe some similarities here too, comparison to North America and the United States to Europe and less developed countries themselves. So in the next video, we're going to start go back to the United States and start looking at suburban growth, sprawl, smart growth, and all the things related to sections 3 and 4. So that's where we're going to pick up in the next video.